Hello. I hope everyone can hear online as well. Welcome to a LEAP research talk. Today, we are extremely lucky to be hearing from Dr. Ori Badaki. We are very lucky at the Digital Futures Institute to have Ora working with us part-time, and also we're super double lucky to have her working with LEAP at the same time. Dr. Badaki's work is at the intersection of education, environmental studies, and communication studies. She also directs the Body Ecology Lab, the Bell Lab, and her current projects examine how power moves through bodies and spaces within food and land systems. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Badaki to take it away. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, it's not on. Rookie mistake.
You have this one.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, yes, that is on. Can everyone hear me okay? Hopefully I will be able to navigate. We'll be doing some movement, and so I may not always use the mic. So if you can't hear me, please let me know. It's lovely to be here with you today. As Charles mentioned, I'm a research scholar at the Digital Futures Institute, as well as LEAP, and my work really looks at the role of embodied learning within climate communications and environmental education. And today I'm going to be presenting kind of a series of provocations, of invitations, of ways to think about the work we're doing, the data that we're engaging with in different lighting, I would say. And so I welcome you to sort of step into that imaginative spirit, to play around and see where that leads you. First, we're going to do a little bit of a movement exercise. You're not going to have to get up. Don't worry about it. Basically, often this is called a body scan. If you have an embodied practice, sometimes it's called somatic scans. Really, this is a way to check in with yourself, right? There's a lot going on right now. I'm sure there's a lot you all are juggling. And so I want to take some time to check in with what's happening within our body. So I'm going to put my mic down for now so I can demonstrate. And if you can't hear me, let me know. So what I'm going to ask you to do is take your hands, put them together, create some friction. Excellent. So in a couple seconds, I'm going to invite you to think of a specific feeling or energy, and we'll close our eyes. It's something that's for you, not for anybody else. And we'll take a couple of breaths together, and you will place your hands on a part of your body where this feeling is most prominent, is most pervasive, right? So first, I'm gonna invite you to place your hands on a part of your body that you feel you've been neglecting. Maybe it's just been something you don't want to think about. Maybe it's just something you want to give some love and energy to, okay? So go ahead and close your eyes. And release. And this time, we're going to invite you to take your hands out of your body and you feel like curiosity lifts. When you feel like there's something you just want to know, something you want to know more about, where does that show up in your body? What starts to do? Let's release. Okay, thank you. So we will be creative. Okay. Hopefully you can hear me online. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to neglect you. I'm going to tap this on. Okay, great. For the question about where you might need to show some love in your body, how many of you place your hands somewhere in your general chest area? Okay. And so basically, most of my work is reminding us that cognition happens all over, right? So we think about cognition, we think about mind, we think about knowledge in an embodied sense, right? But it exists mostly in our heads. And so when we think about how knowledge transfer happens, I think of my work in this general vicinity. And what happens when we add bodies, right, to this image? What happens when there's a conversation between these feelings, these emotions in different parts of our bodies? And so today we're going to think about how to engage different communicative tools to engage the data, the research, the analysis that you're working with in a way that thinks more comprehensively about cognition. I mentioned before that I work at the Digital Futures Institute, and one of the mandates, or I guess not mandate, but pillars of the Institute is thinking about multimodal scholarship. So you can think about the body in lots of ways. I can be in the biomedical sciences, I could be in physical education, I could be in dance education, right? There are lots of ways to think about the body. I think about it from a multimodal perspective. It was interesting, Geneva and I were talking about the Wallerstein panel series. And in I think the Valencia panel, I was hearing a lot of, ooh, this is why it's hard to be an embodied person sometimes, because you got to make sure people can hear you. I was hearing a lot around multimodal data, right? So how AI can ingest multimodal data. So looking at different ways, different types of data to be valued. And what's interesting is I think in the work of multimodal scholarship, it's also about that, but less, not necessarily in terms of how data is represented, right? So how do we think about the various ways modes can interact, not just as representation of knowledge, but as knowledge in and of themselves, right? So for me, the body is a mode, it's a medium. It's the medium through which you engage with and can take in all other senses and modes. And so that's something that really guides the work that I do. So the context I work in, I'm in education, I'm in environmental education, but I work in non-formal contexts, informal and non-formal contexts. And I work in intergenerational contexts where young people are in community with elders and with family, and primarily in urban agriculture. And so one of the things that's really important about communications, climate communications, is the fact that most Americans, I think there was the last Pew study was like 88%, right? 88% of the data that we get, or the climate communications that we get, comes from news, comes from media. I think 69% was friends, right? And so when you add social media into that equation, it's just amplified, right? And so where are the spaces where these sorts of information are coming to the forefront, how people are engaging with these sorts of information. And so I'm working in these sort of communities, also communities that don't need to be convinced that climate change is happening because they see it, right? So they understand how drought is affecting their crops. They understand how salinization is affecting harvest patterns, right? And so it's less about convincing people that it's happening and more about helping them understand how to navigate and adapt to it. But I just wanted to contextualize the space I'm working in, because climate communication is context specific. It depends on where you're working with, who you're working with, and how they are coming to that information. So the research in climate communications is varied in terms of where the field needs to go. But there's kind of three compounding gaps that I tend to work with. On the, I guess it's your left. Is it your left? No, it's your right. Is a work by Marshall McLuhan, who is a famous media scholar. And you might have heard before, the medium is the message, right? And so the idea there is that often we think of what's the information, what do we need to know, and then how do we translate it? How do we then get it to people? But one of the interventions McLuhan made, and others like him, lots of interventions, but one of them was the medium itself has a form, right? It's not like there's information here and then there's translation over there. So if you are working in text in a research article, that's a medium that's informing how that information is getting out. So we need to start with that assumption rather than the information exists, then how do we translate it? So when we think that there's a gap between these two things, then we also sort of fortify this gap between the body and the mind, right? So Cartesian dualism, Descartes, I think therefore I am, again, had lots of other things to say, but we know him for that phrase and also that separation between the mind and the body. And so my proposition, right, my proposal is how do we integrate that to fill these gaps in climate communications that separates and that make it less enticing and inviting for people to actually see themselves in these conversations, these wider conversations. And then the third is a hyper focus on what to know and not how to know. So, behavioral sciences, cognitive sciences, and climate communication talk a lot about the object bias of climate change. So the idea that climate change is a thing that happens rather than a process that people are embroiled in, that systems are embroiled in. And so when we think about what people need to know versus how people know in general, right? Not that people are rational, always rational, and they know information and they take that information. How do we understand how knowledge itself is being constructed within bodies, and how can that inform how we give that knowledge? So not as much on what, we have the data, we know what needs to happen, but how do people know, how do people make these decisions? So the three sort of components of climate communications that I work with the most, this is coming from work at University of Reading, as well as the Yale Project for Climate Communications on effective mechanisms for climate communications. And so three of them are co-creating narratives, harnessing emotion, and engaging media. We know that solastalgia, climate anxiety is on the rise, not just in young people. We talk a lot about young people, but I mean, it's affecting many people. And so how do we harness those emotions rather than ignoring them, or rather than trying to like kick them into the ground? They're going to be there. How do we get that in a space where we can then generate motivation? And I work a lot with media and communications. This is a UN Council on Culture, Entertainment and Culture for Climate Change. And on the bottom, USC School of Communication has a lot of work on engaging Hollywood in climate communications, and behavioral scientists in Hollywood in order to amplify climate messaging. And so one of the things they've done is actually work with people behind the scenes, screenwriters, producers, set designers, right? To actually not just think about climate change and say it's important, but how do we actually represent this? I think one of the studies that came out last year was talking about how one of the biggest effects of media is not necessarily telling you that you should do this, but convincing you that everybody else is, right? Once people think that, oh, everyone else is buying hybrid cars, everyone else is doing solar panels. That's why in movies like The Silent Place, you'll see solar panels like all around. No one is saying, you have to go install them, but it's actually about sort of the more subtle messaging and the convincing that it's a norm that actually changes people's minds when it comes to media specifically. But obviously there's a whole ecosystem, right, of messaging that happens. So these are the three practices that I work closely with. And my lab at Teachers College at the Digital Futures Institute focuses on experimenting with these communicative practices. I work from an ecological basis and foundation. Climate change is obviously very important. That's why we're all here. But this was always going to be important, whether or not climate change was happening. We always needed to understand how to work with our environment in more conscientious ways. And so my lab thinks about how we can use these communicative practices, centering the body, in order to work in communities. So I'm an ethnographer. I do qualitative research. I spend a lot of time working in specific communities. And so, yes, what we're going to look at today is a couple of just like snapshots of work that I have done in Philadelphia, which is my former field site, and now in Rio de Janeiro, which is my current field site, trying to engage with these communicative practices. So the first is climate storytelling. I talked a little bit about the work that's happening right now in the industry. There are lots of moves being made, fellowships. Actually, I don't know, this administration, we don't know, but there were a lot of moves being made in order to engage climate storytelling in creative ways. This is one of the things I did. My doctorate is in literacy, and so one of the things I did when I was doing field work was create writing workshops with young people, where they were taking the data or the information that they were learning about and reimagining them. We were working at a farm that prioritizes African diasporic growing practices, and one of the contentious pieces of information that we were trying to grapple with was this idea or this legend. Some say it. If you talk to Michael Twitty, who's a historian, he says this is not true. If you talk to Leah Penniman, who's a farmer and historian, she says it is. But there's a the idea that enslaved Africans would sow seeds, right, into hair in order for survival, right, once they were crossing the Atlantic. And that's a story that's told. There is a cartographer, Judith Carney, who's done work, who's traveled the world, interviewed people, and traced lineages and said, no, this actually happened. But what's important there is that there was knowledge of how to grow. There was knowledge of how to survive. Some think the seeds are just a metaphor for that. Some think they were real. But we were working with this. We were reading Judith Carney's work and thinking about what this would look like in the future, right? So this is, quote unquote, this is science fiction. This is a science fiction, speculative fiction story. Dorothy Fontenberry, who's a climate writer, talks about the fact that if climate isn't in your story, then it's science fiction. So there's a sort of, there's leeway, right? There's flexibility in terms of what is fiction and what is science. But to write good science fiction, you need to know actual science. So we were working with two things, two texts. Judith Carney's work, and then there was, in Philadelphia at the time, there was a citywide urban agricultural development plan that from the mayor's office, trying to figure out how to systematize and make sure that there weren't redundancies and that resources were being deployed effectively for community gardens. So we were taking this landscape and working with it, and so they came up with this. This is the synopsis. I'm going to see if this works. Hopefully this works. I'm going to play one of the youth writers in a very dramatic way wanted to read the synopsis. Let's see if this works.
Ada is part of a group of orphans sent to become food cultivators on a new planet. Along the journey, she finds that she can time travel in her dreams, that her destiny is tied to the powerful okra seed. With the help of her friends, Ada has to unlock the mystery of her past in order to reveal a hidden conspiracy that threatens all of their futures. This is her story.
The dream would always go something like this. I'm sitting in a chair in the living room while my feet are dangling in the air. It's raining outside, and my mom is watching the news.
Okay. So this was like a rudimentary audio play that we did, but really it was an opportunity to, one, do some perspective taking, right? So one of the most intangible or intractable aspects of climate communications is getting people to change their minds, right? Daniel Kahan has done a lot of work on the actual polarization. The more climate literacy you have, the more likely that you're going to be, not more likely you'll be polarized, but there's a high chance of polarization, because what climate literacy doesn't necessarily make it so you know more about climate. It makes it so you have more fodder for your argument, right? So the idea of perspective taking and having people be able to step back, right, from this is me, this is what I believe, these are my ideals, this is my knowledge, and take on perspectives of different characters is one mechanism that is useful for climate communications. MIT has I think it's called narrative empathy, where they study the relationship between storytelling and heightened rates of empathy. And so one of the things that we were doing here was having young people not only take on those characters, but write those characters, write on those worlds in a way that was very tangible and meaningful for their lived experiences. So climate storytelling is one of these communicative tools. These are some more insights from them. I'm gonna move on in the interest of time, but we might be able to come back to listen to their voices, because I do think it's important to listen to their voices. So as I said before, good science fiction requires good science. We taught workshops to younger children. So I was working with high schoolers. We taught workshops to younger, like not preschool, elementary schoolers, where we were using, you'll see Leah Penniman's book there. You'll see a couple of children's books, and then mapping out what these look like in an embodied way, right? So rather than just saying they walk down the street, taking these actual lines from the book and mapping out what it looked like, what it felt like, what it sounded like, all of that, and then using that to write the scenes. Because to write for performance, you need to write in an embodied way. You need to direct people how they're going to move through space, go stage right, look left, breathe, all of this stuff, right? And so it was already built into that format, that communicative tool. And so making sure that they were coming from a rigorous basis in order to tell these, fiction stories, these stories of fiction, but rooted in reality. We also had, oh, I already talked about this, perspective taking. So I'm going to move on. I'm ahead of the game. One of the things that we did as well was publish this screenplay, right? So we had young people were able to meet with producers and meet with others in the actual industry to think about maybe a career in climate storytelling, right? So we think about green economy, we think about probably, we don't necessarily think about storytellers, we don't necessarily think about artists. And so part of this work is thinking about, if we're thinking about a green economy, how many different types of jobs, how many different types of opportunities are available to young people. Okay, we're gonna take a little break to think about what I've shared. If you could think about this question, what is a data story that you feel would make a great screenplay? And why? I think I saw one data story on the LEAP website, but I'm not sure if there's more. I think the one on carbon sinks. But yeah, I would love for folks to just take some time. It would be great if you can turn and talk, but if you would rather just reflect on your own, that's totally fine. We'll take, time is it? We'll take 5 minutes. And I would love to hear what some of your thoughts are. This is also just a way for me to get good material. So don't disappoint. No, I'm kidding. We'll come back in 5 minutes and then we'll go from there. I'm gonna stop sharing and maybe play some music so it's not awkward.
Yeah. Screenplay, do you is the format like a TV show or?
So like it's up to, it could be a feature, it could be a short, it could be a TV series, it could be a documentary, right? So it just, what I mean by screenplay, and that's a good question. What I mean by screenplay is something that is meant to be performed rather than something that is meant to be read on the page. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, you can start wrapping up for now. And we can form a screenwriting group after if there's some really good ideas. I wrote 2 screenplays before I wrote my dissertation. So I was like, it was 100%, but it was fun. But it was also like I needed to train myself to write for a long time. Yeah. So I needed to write something I actually liked writing to prove, as opposed to the dissertation. I don't know. I think I'm onto something. All right, we'll come back together. I would love to hear maybe 1 or 2 ideas, and especially the why, right? Because I think what makes the why important is your expertise and your knowledge of what it means to be part of whatever fields that you're talking about. So yeah, anybody would brave enough to share? No judgment. I believe in you. I really do. I believe in us all. Yes, thank you.
It's low stakes. It's not my research.
Okay, that's fine.
Should I like?
Oh, yes.
Hello. Okay, so I'm pulling on some research that was presented during the Climate Week LEAP event on flooding last September, and I think it's under Tien's leadership. But it's about thinking about 311, like City of New York. What do you call them? Like reports of flooding. And using that as like a source of multimodal data and triangulating it with other like sensors and maybe some like preparedness actions as well, and like what the resilience. So that's kind of like, that's Tien and this researcher at Columbia, like that's their project. But we were saying that's kind of fun to think about a screenplay because it's like the human element and you have different boroughs and regions of New York City coming together that maybe wouldn't interact. And it's, yeah, so that's kind of a fun way to take multiple types of data.
Yeah.
To tell a story.
Yeah, I would watch that. I would very much watch that. Thank you for sharing. Anybody else? The Band-Aid's been ripped open, y'all. Now it's just out there festering. Whatever that analogy is. Okay. Yeah, no, I think that was great. I think, and part of what I was hearing is you were sharing that is getting into the like specific interactions, right? So not just this data set and this data set and this data set, right? How do they interact? And I think that's a core aspect of multimodal scholarship in that it's less about oh, this is a film, and then this is a movie, or sorry, movies and films are the same. This is a picture, this is an audiobook, this is something else, but how do those modalities interact? And what is the guiding modality, right? So even if it's an embodied, that's the guiding modality, how does that interact with the other modalities at play? And so I think that interaction is really important. I stopped sharing, so I'm going to start sharing again. All right, so the second communicative tool I wanted to experiment with, I have been experimenting with and I want to share with you is performance and exhibition. I think I forgot to mention I am a dancer as well, so that's one of the reasons why an embodied analysis makes sense. And so this is an exhibit that I had at the Digital Features Institute last year, and actually is now a performance that I will be doing tonight as soon as I leave here. But it was rooted in field work that I did on the farm, thinking about seed keeping, and the spaces I was invited into talked more about seed keeping rather than seed saving. So seed saving is trying to preserve the genetic properties of a seed so that it can propagate. However, seed keeping is also preserving those stories, right? It's seeing seeds as a system rather than sort of one productive entity. And so when you see seeds in that way, what are the multimodal, generative ways that you can engage with that knowledge? And so one of the things I did was think about performance ethnography. This is Soyini Madison is a performance ethnographer who uses performance as a way to do research, right? So turning data into plays, making sure that when she's talking to people or doing interviews, right, she's thinking about performance, thinking about the ways that they're engaging in space in very mindful ways, and then also researching performance, right? So it's both sides of the coin, using performance as research and researching performance. One of the things she talks about is theory makes the body contact. Theory makes body contact, bodies that most often look like yours. You realize you are part of two locations and more, both sides of the wall and the in-betweens. Theories can come from anywhere. And you decide to go back across inside the wall, to the seminar, to the books, to recognize again and more. And so even though many of you might be dealing with very tangible, hard data sets, they are in some ways separate from the air that you are breathing at the moment, the water that you're about to drink. And sometimes they're very, very close, right? And so if we think about the body as a way to bridge that gap, bring those walls together between whether it's a theory, whether it's a data set, whether it's something else that's far away, and then how do we invite others to do the same? And sometimes that's expertise that you don't care about or you don't have, but how do we engage, how do we collaborate in order to make that happen? So back to the seed and sound piece, this was this piece, right? And you also saw a picture of that at the beginning of this presentation. This was based off of, a lot of the work I did before this was archival and historical. So this is based off of another workshop that we were leading at the farm on the Stono Rebellion, which was in South Carolina, 1739. And it's rumored to have been started by a man who was playing the drum. One way that the news of the revolt was happening was through the drum. And so after the Stono Rebellion, there was the Negro Act of 1740, which, among many things, as you can see, enslaved folks couldn't assemble, they couldn't raise their own food, they couldn't earn money, they couldn't read English, and they also could not play music. And so this was really interesting to me because music and percussion specifically is a really big part of, I trained in West African dance, so it's a very big part of that practice. And so I was thinking about that in conjunction with this story. So this is coming back to Judith Carney's work, and she traces the variety of rice called Oryza glaberrima, which is indigenous to West Africa, and is thought to be a predecessor of the Carolina Gold variety of rice, which was a huge cash crop for the South in during the slave trade. And so one of the things she talks about is that knowledge. It's not just that variety of rice came here. She traces it through Brazil to Suriname to, I forget the last place, but then all the way down to Carolina. She talks about that knowledge, that rice not being the only thing, right? But the knowledge of how to cultivate, how to grow that rice being transferred as well. And so I was learning about this as I was training in a dance style called Konkoba, which comes from the Western Senegambia region, specifically Guinea and Mali. And it's a Mandinka dance. The Mandinka people who aren't traditionally known for rice cultivation, but the Konkoba dance is specifically, it's called the dance of the good worker. And it is specifically, many think, is a dance specifically for rice. And so one way that this knowledge gets transferred across the diaspora, not just within, the seed itself, but also the systems around the seed, the art practices, the storytelling practices that transfers this knowledge. And so what I'm going to do now is show you some of the moves from Konkoba, and you'll see, things that look very familiar. And so I think what would be the premise or the invitation is to take something very similar and almost like overly didactic, not similar, simple and overly didactic, and see how you can expand that, right? Something that everybody thinks they have access to. What are the deeper levels that go beyond that? So this is some dance from, let's see if that works, Konkoba. So Mamadi Keita is a renowned djembe player from Guinea, Bissau, I think, or maybe it's Conakry. I can't remember. So let's hope my mic stays on. Thank you. Now everybody get up. I'm kidding. I'm kidding. If you want to, you're invited. But I would love to hear, what are some of the things that you saw that looked familiar? Or maybe things that didn't look familiar. Anything at all. Just observations in general.
I just wanted to add that you're really practicing what you're preaching by making your presentation very multimodal.
Thank you.
And I know there's a space around you for the first time, and I was focusing on slides now. I'm like, okay, you're a person.
Yeah.
Okay, so, but that's not anything about the dance.
No, that's huge. I think noticing the space, right? Like in the same way when we show the at the beginning, the pictures of the brains, right? Which is, yes, very important, but noticing that actually that's a disembodied head. Like, where's the rest of the body, It's just priming ourselves to notice more, right? Or notice in a different way. And then we can choose. Actually, like, I don't really care about that. But the danger is when we don't even know that there's another way to look at it. So one of the things that literacy scholars who study embodied learning talk a lot about is there's a lot of there is a lot of control of bodies in schools, right? Sit down, raise your hand, walk in line, look at me, look over there, da 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 da. But it's a very disembodied experience. It can be a very disembodied experience in schools. It's not something, well, now there's a lot of work in sort of socio-emotional learning, which is really important to get us back to think, to get kids to be able to think about their bodies. But bodies are always being controlled, right? Space, disability studies has done a lot to show us that space is never not political and never not a conscious choice. And so what you said about noticing space is really, really important. And then you can decide, okay, I see that, cool, like what else is there, right? Or actually, okay, I want to dig in, right? So that's actually really important. Any other noticings? Yes.
Maybe you were sowing rice seeds.
Thank you. Exactly. Exactly. Right. So this is one of the moves that's very popular. And so a lot of the rice growing in this region was in mangroves. And one of the practices was rather than planting, right, individually, because you never know, things could get flooded, you know, there's the viability, you never know. So you just throw, you throw and hope for the best, right? And so that's one practice. Oh, no, oh, I forgot this move. So there's one move that goes like this, where there's a little twist. And one of the things that move represents is digging holes, digging mounds, right? And so mound farming, mound rice cultivation is also a practice that this community is known for. And these are very, you know, they're not revolutionary, but when you take those cues and then open up, right? So I'm doing archival research, right, on just those two moves and what that can tell us about the knowledge that was brought over, as well as the seeds themselves. All right. I am going to just, yeah, we'll save this for now. I just want to make sure, like, at least share the other two communicative tools, and then hopefully we'll have some time for discussion. So this is more my newer work in Rio de Janeiro. I'm doing community mapping with quilombos, and we'll talk a little bit about, yes, okay, good. I saw this coming. I had a slide for that. Nice. So quilombola communities are communities where escaped enslaved folks, they're home to the descendants of escaped enslaved folks. So Brazil is very, very big, and there were a lot of people who escaped slavery. And they're actually communities, they're maroon communities, right? So they're self-contained up until the 80s, 1988, I think. They were outlawed in Brazil. But these are communities that are now coming into sort of social light, and also have practices that like run deep because they've had to keep themselves alive outside of, you know, in an autonomous way for so long. And so I'm doing mapping, community mapping with them around food systems, around foodways, specifically around seed keeping. And the Quilombo I'm working with right now, Quilombo Camorin, is here in the southwestern region. It is right in Pedra Branca, which is the largest urban forest, I think in South America, but definitely in Brazil, and also responsible for preserving, the community members at Quilombo Camarin are also responsible for preserving much of the biodiversity there, right? So they are cultural curators as well as environmental stewards. So one of the things that we're working on there is community mapping. In case, you know, that's a newer term. It's you bring a map to a community. People do it different ways. There's roots from cartography and geography, and sometimes it's actually about the community creates like a map distinct from anything else. The type that I practice looks at participatory asset mapping, and so you bring in an existing map, maybe a visualization, a leap map, right? Like we can think about future projections, we can think about historical data, and then you get levels of granularity based off of what the community can offer, right? So yes, you might think that water levels are like this every April, but the farmers are going to let you know, actually, this is what's happening, right? And so I think part of this aspect of community mapping is privileging the embodied experience of the folks whose space that you're trying to map. And right now there's a project in Rio to map that on, I'm using the word map a lot, but map that on to sort of more systems level mapping for providing resources, especially to marginalized communities like quilombos. And this is Carlidia Almeida. She is an agronomist and a quilombola woman, and she's talking about the difference between seed keeping and seed saving here, but I'm sure you can access it, so I won't read it out. And then the partners that we have for this map, right, this mapping project is Quilombo Camorin, as I just mentioned, but we're working on a multi-scalar level, right? So Quilombo Camorin is one of, I think there's like 200 in Rio. Don't quote me on that, but there's a lot. And then CONACI is the National Organization for Quilombo communities. And ABA is the Brazilian Association for Agroecology. And so we're working on these different scales to do these maps and then also be able to bring them all together. We're working in 1 Quilombo right now, and then we'll work in 2 next year, 3 years, so on and so forth. Time. We may be able to come back to this. This is the last tool and the one that's very new. That's why I just have this like block of text, because this is all the data. This is all the archive I have for all the artifacts that I have. So there's a project right now also in Rio it's right here, use artificial intelligence to improve community preparedness, response, and recovery to extreme climate events in the Acari Basin and Jaji Maravilha. And so this is very much in LEAP's wheelhouse, right? How do we actually use these mechanisms, these technologies to prepare people for climate shocks in advance, right? Rather than in a way that doesn't help them. And so this project is also about creating a chatbot, but my work is less about the creation of the chatbot and how that actually gets used and assimilated and worked with in communities, because you might have a resource that has no relevance in a space. And so what we're doing there is using all of the other 3 communicative tools that I mentioned. So climate storytelling, performance, and community mapping, to think about how to design workshops using this chatbot. So it's not like these exist obviously they don't exist on extremes or on islands. How can these communicative tools work together? I want to leave time for questions. I will say these 2 projects in Rio, the mapping, the Storied Seeds project, and this AI chatbot project are very much in a space where people are looking, right, for experts like yourselves, right? People who have specific expertise and specific climate processes, earth processes, all of that. But how do we engage with these knowledge sets in a way that, again, considers the entire body and considers kind of a more comprehensive look at how knowledge gets transferred? And so to recap, I basically talked about 2 things. How do we engage the medium as much as we do the message, right? Going back to McLuhan. And how do we center the body as an important medium for messaging and communications? Here are some questions for consideration that can prompt kind of a revista review of or reassessment, right, of some of the work that you might be doing. And maybe, maybe prompt a creative, either a creative expression for yourself or a creative collaboration. Because a lot of the work I do too is bringing climate scientists and artists and storytellers together. And so that's the space that I occupy and the space that most excites me. And so with that, I will say obrigada, or thank you. And we're done for today. I am very much open for questions, but I also have some questions here for you. So yeah, it depends. I think we have maybe 10 more minutes. Oh, sorry, they're here. They're both here. I was greedy.
We have 10 minutes for questions or more dancing if you'd like to join.
I am
if there are
always up for
questions
that.
in the room, please raise your hand. We're going to go to Geneva.
Hey, I'm really curious to hear your perspective on using VR and like virtual reality and even like generative AI VR as a mechanism to embody and understand things like disaster or like climate risks. And also like I've heard it as a medium for like decision support and disaster management scenarios. It's almost like a further disconnection of self from the body, but I think it's an attempt to actually bring the brain into a lived experience. But I'm really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yes, I really love that question because there's Deb Thomas is a anthropologist and a dancer as well. And one of the things that I've talked with her about is the idea of dance as a portal, right? So one of the reasons I bring in dance whenever I can is because that's the one time in my life where I'm not overthinking, where I literally can relinquish whatever's happening in my prefrontal cortex, but I also have complete agency. Like I don't feel lost, right? And so in a lot of, especially folk dance traditions, traditional dances, it's not just about the movement, right? It's about what it connects you with. So one of the things we talk about is like there is a way in which these orientations toward dance and movement predate, like they were the original generative or extended reality sort of stuff, right? Like it already extended you into other spaces, other conversations, and that was the original intent. But rather than remove you from where you are, right, and like have you deal with not have you deal with the consequences of where you are, it was extending your presence, whether it's connected to your ancestors, to the land, to each other, whatever it is, in order to be more rooted in that time and space. And so, yeah, I don't know enough, right, about VR and extended reality to have like a strong opinion or yay or nay, but I also just don't think it's too different. It might be like a new, new bottle, the wine in a new bottle. But I think there are ways that people have already been thinking about bodies and movement in ways that go beyond the sort of materiality.
So I've heard a bunch of people say like art thrives when society is kind of in a mess, and like science is in a bit of a mess in this country at the moment. One, do you believe that thesis is correct? And then do you see that kind of climate art is kind of changing in response to events right now? And yeah, any thoughts there?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that, especially in the industry, people talk about a lot is hope, right? Like we need hope, we need hope, we need hope. And I think that's true. I don't think the antidote to climate anxiety is hope. I think it's justice. I think a lot of the research coming out on at least youth and what's provoking, climate anxiety is not necessarily it's distrust or it's not having hope in government officials and like people. It's not having hope in some like weird ephemeral thing. It's like they just don't think people are going to do what they need to do. And so rather than say we need you to like believe in this thing, someone's going to come and save us, we just need to show you that we'll do what we need to do, and then you have hope, right? And so I think in terms of like the art space, there was just reading the study, I think her name is Milan from University of Wisconsin or something, where she was looking at art, like the difference between data visualization and artistic representation of the climate process. And I can't remember which, it's the one that came out of Hawaii, the curve that came out of the observatory in Hawaii. I can't remember. Thank you. What is it? Thank you, Keeling curve. So there's that like very famous graph, and then there's an artist rendering of that. And so one of the things that she did was collect. It was it was a national representative study, I think, but to see if that made a difference. It's the same quote unquote source material, and there wasn't a difference in terms of like I now believe I love the climate or whatever. But what the difference was is that there was a personal connection, both bad and good, right? Both negative and positive. But like at least the person was entering into that conversation as like a person versus with the graph, which is, a very important information, there wasn't that movement in. And again, that doesn't mean it's good because people also had negative responses. But I think there's something there about the power of art to just make you feel. I mean, we all know this. But I think, yeah, people, lots of people have theories of change when it comes to motivation, what makes people act. And I think it's always changing and will always be changing. But I do think engaging that affect is really important. And the other thing I'll say is like, the people who understand this best is big oil and big gas. Like this is not the sort of this is being weaponized every day, right? In a way that doesn't serve us. And so yeah, it's less about it's less about like embodied learning is liberatory and great because also people feel trapped and hurt by their bodies. Like that's not, I'm not advocating for like more focus on that if that's the case, but I do think like acknowledging that it's there, and then acknowledging that there are forces at play that really understand exactly how to turn the knob up here and how to turn the knob down there to make you feel a certain way without you really thinking about anything. Yes. You're fine.
So thanks again for a great talk and the multimodalness of it all. Maybe this is going back to Geneva's question and like thinking about like what can we do with our own research. So I think of, I mean, climate there's some technical definition, but very, very simply, there's a trend, and then there's a seasonal cycle, an interannual cycle, and so on. And to me, it just trips me that embodied experiences. I mean, I come from a culture where there's seasonal dances, there's a spring festival, there's an autumn festival, and I think this is universal. To a large degree, and so the seasonal cycle is captured. Long-term trend unclear, or maybe there are instances of that being the case, or maybe because the warming has been so. I mean, my paleoclimate is a bit hazy, but I think, I would say that the past 100 years or so has been the sharpest rise in warming compared to at least the past 5,000 years. Maybe there have been little ice ages here and there. I don't know if there's some research around there to see how that has changed embodied experience.
Right.
Yeah, I'm just curious if you've thought about this too, right? The seasonal cycle is captured. But what about the trend, the long term?
Over time. Yeah, I think that's so important because a lot of similarly, I think, like you said, every indigenous culture probably has, okay, this is the dance that we do. This is the way before written text was introduced, right? This was the way that knowledge was passed down. And so I think the key there is thinking about predictability, right? So what climate change does is make things not predictable. And, I think this has been debated, but, the common refrain was human civilization started when we could predict the harvesting cycle. We could create, agricultural systems. I don't have, other people can debate that, but I do think that predictability aspect is important. And with these dances, we often think of traditional dances in the same way we think of the climate or environment as like, it's just there. Like, it's like, let's go back to where it was before. And it's always like changes have always been happening, right? And these dances, so in the 60s, in the mid 60s, a lot of these traditional dances, when at least in West Africa, when these countries were getting independence, one of the main nationalist tools was creating these big ballets. And then these dances went from being in the forests to initiation ceremonies or whatever to then being like choreographed for stage, right? And that changes. Like, so what I did right there as Konkoba, maybe that was what was done 100 years ago, but all I know is that that's what the National Ballet of Guinea-Bissau was doing, right? And so that changes, those like over time, these traditional dances also change. And so I think it's like, how are we being receptive to those micro changes or macro changes? And then how are we adjusting in order to predict, in order to be able to say this is what's coming? But yeah, I think it's one of those things where you have to be on your toes, which is why it helps to just be able to move around because things will always be changing,
Not to be too down on the US, but like I feel like the analogy that comes to mind is some NFL cheerleading dance. Maybe it's too warm, like in 20 years, that they'll have to move it, change the seasons. But I think to your point that these micro changes are where maybe there's some signal and reflection to be done.
Exactly. That's great. Thank you. Of course. Thank you for the question.